Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fifth panel. I'm just going to hand it straight off to our moderator, Matthew.
Excellent. Okay, so welcome everybody to the first annual Max Stirner Conference. This is our second afternoon panel and our fifth panel overall, entitled Unorthodox Applications of Stirner. We'll have two presentations here from our presenters and then followed by a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session. With that out of the way, let me introduce our first presenter, Corey Mora, who is a MA student at Duquesne University in the philosophy department, and his presentation is entitled Stirner, the State and Personal Identity.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for being in attendance and for all the hard work in putting together this symposium. All right. So the context of this paper, it was that I was trying to find an application for political organization in Stirner, and I noticed it had a lot of relevance with some contemporary political events. So without much editorializing, I'm just going to get right into it. So in the wake of recent state legislation across the United States, several governments are now placing much more attention on queer identities, bodies, and ideas as a whole. Often these attempts are more restrictive, but a few can be considered as expansive. Take, for example, access to public restrooms, a contentious topic for some state legislatures, in which the state decides to either codify and protect trans individuals and provide them a right to use these facilities that match their gender, or to outlaw trans individuals from using them. This often brings up notions of queer individuals, or specifically trans individuals, as second-class citizens, or perhaps even worse. Since the state is the sole authority to dish out rights to any identity, it also has the capacity to criminalize any identity. In fact, insofar as any identity becomes known to the state that differs from whatever normative notions of national or state character that has been built, each identity must effectively be legalized through the state apparatus. Many different identity groups have experienced this legalization or codification process, from Black Americans in the legacy of slavery or other racial identities being first-time introductees into census data, such as the term Hispanic first appearing in 1980. As well as any other queer activity needing to be decriminalized across state governments up until the legalization of same-sex marriage across all 50 states in 2015. What seems to be the issue at hand is that when a state has a national character or a national identity, it must exclude any identity that does not fall into this grander national. A few results emerge from this, namely that those in the included group are granted full political enfranchisement as citizens, and those that fall outside of these identity groups are seen as mainly criminal or in some cases a second-class citizen. Along with political enfranchisement, citizens are granted numerous rights or protections that those who are criminalized do not have, leaving the excluded identities unprotected from any form of interpersonal abuses, as well as being left to the whims of state violence. To combat this, identity groups often try to legitimate their identity through banding together and creating a coherent identity group with explicit goals as to be seen as legitimate by the state. The issue on this hand, however, is a process of repetition of the flaws of the state's national identity. For example, in the queer community and in queer politics, the issue surrounding on who is included and excluded is at a fever pitch, with explicitly LGB organizations forming to distance and exclude trans individuals. Biphobia, or phobia of any more fluid sexuality, are also an issue within the queer community and spaces, further driving points of exclusion, down to the debates on optics and civility. Even regarding pride parades, there are often surrounding conversations about the visual markers of queerness and what is deemed appropriate behavior at such events. This is to say that identity groups have the same issue of trying to be legitimated by the state through the state's terms, and any element within the identity that may otherwise be included is excluded in this project due to the fear of its perceived incompatibility. In this paper, I am exploring exactly this issue, the issue of personal identities and the state, by applying the work of Max Stirner to not only give an account of how these cycles of division happen, but how we may also escape this cycle of inclusions and exclusions through recognizing similarities in one another, but not turning any particular act or quality into a reified identity, but rather adopting and understanding the unique and organizing for liberation on the basis of the union of egoists. So, Stirner's section on political liberalism, found in the Unique in Its Property, contains his brief account of the origins of the state and the nation, and how it becomes the sole grantor of rights to all fields of life. To begin, Stirner references an idea of the reified human being, in which once a community recognizes the human being in an individual, one then treats one as such. However, with this comes the consequence that whomever is not seen as a human being, one is then treated as such. As Stirner writes, whoever sees something other than human beings in us, in him we will likewise not see a human being, but an inhuman monster, and will meet him as an inhuman monster. End quote. What this entails is that at a base level, some notion of a reified human being is at play, an essence of humanity that one could possess or conflict with. Once one conflicts with this notion, one is not guaranteed the same treatment as those observed to possess the qualities of the reified human being. Once those who do observe this quality among themselves, of observing that others do possess this quality, the nation and state are formed near simultaneously. As Stirner writes, so let's stick together and protect the human being in each other. We find the necessary protection in our sticking together and in ourselves, the ones who stick together, a community of those who know their human dignity and stick together as human beings. Our sticking together is the state. We who stick together are the nation. In an effort to preserve and protect the status quo of the human being, those that determine what that entails define the national makeup, whereas the actions taken by those in this nation constitute the state and its apparatuses. Already we can see the exclusionary language at play in the othering of those who are not identified as human beings, excluding them both from the nation and the state. This would then leave the excluded inhuman identities, thus left to the whims of the state, in its effort to preserve and protect the human being due to the fact of it not being included within the nation. Since the reified human being is at core the most important aspect of what determines inclusion within the state, there are several methods in which either the state reinforces this identity, as well as means of internalizing this identity, making one blind to its existence and assuming it is a non-ideological default existence, where others are deviations from it at best or threats to it at worst. Because the state is only concerned with the human being as a reified identity, it must therefore remove any additional aspect of the particular individual's character, reducing them down to mere human being. As Stirner writes, just this, that the state shows no consideration for my person, that to it I am, like everyone else, just a human being, without having any other significance to impress it. End quote. What is at stake here is a double blindness on the state's end, that those who conform to the state identity, those with full citizenship and permission to live their lives, are only considered human beings as such. They have invisible identities, a presumed natural default. However, on the other hand, any marker of inhumanity, those acts, qualities, or identities the state does not incorporate into citizenship, are seen as markedly different, a definite other. With this double blindness to the creation of the essence of humanity and the construction of excluded identities, one can more easily identify one's own good with the good of the state. As Stirner explains, quote, the state should be a community of free and equal human beings, and everyone should devote himself to the good of the whole, merge into the state, make the state his aim and ideal, end quote. This end of the human being merging into the state is to view the state as an extension of one's own identity, further constituting notions of nationalism within the citizen where what the state claims to be good, desirable, or to its benefit is to also imply it is inherently good for the citizen. It follows then that anything that is good for the non-citizen, the inhuman, would be detrimental to the state, to the citizen. This creates a dangerous feedback loop within the nation state in which one may be excluded from. What is left then is the place for the inhuman and its place in this image of how liberal society operates. If on the basis that you are granted your human rights through citizenship and granted citizenship through this constructed human essence, then whatever marks one as outside either the state or humanity necessarily excludes you from rights by citizenship, as well as from being included into humanity as a whole. Stirner notes that since the state now has oversight of all things must be allowed by the state. As he writes, quote, "It has revealed the Lord alone who confers legal titles, and without whose permission nothing is authorized," end quote. Since only the state authorizes all activity, one need not look much further than the aforementioned use of restrooms by trans individuals, who need their existence to be legalized and codified by the state. Once visibility of trans persons increased, the state encountered an identity it had to determine whether to include or exclude, to determine if these individuals should have permission to exist, as well as use basic public facilities. What the state must do, therefore, in response to any new identity that challenged the constructed human essence, is to use the law as a way of medicalizing, criminalizing, or pathologizing these different behaviors, qualities, or acts. This can be seen as an attempt to bring out the correct way to be human out of the excluded individual. Such efforts are seen in historical examples, such as the infamous speech given by R.H. Pratt, which stated, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man," end quote, in reference to indigenous Americans and the purpose of reform schools, as well as conversion therapy for queer youths today. The inhuman then is to be treated as a disease, as something to be eliminated or pushed out of sight, so that the correct individual can then emerge and be granted full rights to citizenship. Stirner notes this kind of relationship, that the state is then placed as the sole arbiter of what is permitted, that one can only be what the state allows. Quote, "Do I have anything without the state's approval? What I have without this approval, it takes away from me as soon as it discovers the lack of a legal title. So don't I have everything by its grace, by its approval?" End quote. With this then, various identities have often banded together in reaction against the state's criminalizing of themselves, in order to gain the state's approval to exist without threat of harm, to simply have a right to exist. The issue, however, emerges internally once an identity group makes the same move the state does, creating a reified idea of whatever the identity is and how it ought to be creating its own, how it ought to be, thus creating its own inclusions and exclusions. By applying the same critique of the essence of humanity to any kind of essence of any identity, we can see internal conflicts emerge around practices of inclusion and exclusion, primarily due to having to legitimate an identity on the state's terms. To illustrate this phenomena, I'll refer to contemporary issue within queer politics. To begin, the simple definition of queerness that I will be using as a concept is that queerness is non-participation in any normative structure of sexuality, gender, romance, or gender expression. The concept presented does not try to posit an essence of queerness, but rather how to define this axis of exclusion from constructed normative identities. Within this organization of queerness, there is an ongoing controversy generated by LGB organizations, specifically the LGB Alliance, the group that explicitly excludes trans individuals as a part of the grander queer community. In an article titled "LGB Alliance, Anti-Trans Lobby Groups Troubling Ugly History," written by Lily Wakefield, Wakefield reports not just on the exclusionary practice of this group, but also its hostility to the excluded. Writing, LGBT Alliance claims its purpose is to see lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals living free from discrimination or disadvantage based on their sexual orientation, end quote. Or not end quote, sorry. But ever since its inception, the organization has campaigned to erode trans rights and paint the trans community as dangerous to women and children, end quote. Not content to just exclude from a grander project of queer liberation, the LGBT Alliance seeks to further alienate and advocate against those that do not fit into the reified concepts of sexuality within queerness. What constitutes reification on the end of the LGBT Alliance is found within their court hearing claims. In an article covering the court hearing of the LGBT Alliance's charity status, Amelia Gentleman reports that the LGBT Alliance says that it was founded to stand up for the rights of same-sex attracted people, end quote. If queerness is to be reified as specifically only same-sex attraction, then anything outside of that is not included in the identity of queerness, as it tries to legitimate itself through the state. It can be further the case that sex and gender are reified as mutual in the understanding of human essence at a deeper level, leaving the trans community excluded from both certain queer organizations as well as the broader scope of human rights and full citizenship. Julia Serrano, in her work Excluded, makes the same point that, quote, exclusion is based on the premise that certain ways of being gendered or sexual are more legitimate, natural, or righteous than others, end quote. That there are other layers of reification at process within exclusionary processes, often in the same double blindness of the citizen's created identity, as non-ideological natural defaults. Those that differ from these assumed defaults will then be excluded against and left persecuted as inhuman, even from groups that they may otherwise have been included in the first place. To escape this cycle, one must avoid the tendency to construct and reify identities. A resolution to the issue of inclusion and exclusion of identity categories is to forego the attempt to make them into a reified term, that there is no essence available to capture something as queerness. The alternative has two main ideas, one being that in queer organization, at least, that what broadly constitutes queerness is non-participation in normative expressions or performances of gender, along with romantic and sexual attraction. Queerness would then only need to be defined in the negative as deviation from any normative claims about sexuality, gender, or gender expression. With this, one could also adopt Stirner's language of the unique, in which one is no longer reduced to any particular reified concept. In reference to the unique, Stirner explains, in Stirner's Critics, quote, what Stirner says is a word, a thought, a concept. What he means is neither a word nor a thought nor a concept. What he says is not the meaning, and what he means cannot be said, end quote. The unique itself is not meant to be any kind of reified concept, but a close summation would be the fundamental inexpressibility of the totality of any individual. Where reified identities would reduce a person down to a constructed category, the language of the unique leaves one unbound to any identity in particular. What this could prove fruitful for is that any of the aforementioned exclusionary practices mentioned within queer politics particularly no longer have a place to stand, and that the political activity need not be based on what queer ought to be and look like, but rather in shared similarity. Stirner is not opposed to understanding similarity in qualities among individuals, nor opposed to working with others based off of these similarities. As Stirner notes, quote, without a doubt, I am similar to others. However, this holds good only for comparison or reflection, end quote. To deny a reified identity is not to deny similarity. In short, excuse me. If one were to recapture the political imagination of queerness, one might only state the similarity of those who are under threat of harm due to their acts or qualities, similar through their exclusion from the state, rather than needing to posit a universal aspect or experience of queerness. Thank you all.
Excellent, Corey. Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Tim Elmo Fighton, who's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Cincinnati in philosophy and life sciences, and his presentation is entitled Reading Max Stirner Through the Sciences of Life and Mind.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to share my screen, and I believe here it is. Stop me if you can't see it, but I think you can. All right. Thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. It's really great. Unfortunately, I don't get to work on Stirner as much as I would like to because I'm in the clutches of academic philosophy, I guess, and I work on something else, but I'm really excited about this. And I'm trying to hopefully settle at least some of the debts from my last publication, where I said I was going to talk about the brain a lot, but I ended up talking a lot about other things as well. So here's some more brain. I start, like I did in that paper, with Feuerbach's objection to Stirner's book, where he said, and I believe that Adam Jones already quoted this, but can you sever masculinity from what is called your mind? Isn't your brain the most sacred and elevated organ of your body definitely masculine? And to me, this interaction is pretty amazing because it's in the 1840s and you already have this this notion that the brain is the truth of the self and gender is the truth of the self, and they are intersecting in this profound way here. And of course, we know that Stirner says that he doesn't really care about the essence of masculinity. He says humanity and masculinity do not express you exhaustively, and you can therefore be indifferent to everything that is held up to you as true humanity or true masculinity. So he rejects gender as the truth of the self, but what about the brain? And around that time I was thinking about that, I also discovered the work of Catherine Malabou. So a little bit optimistically, I took up her question, which culture is the culture of neuronal liberation, and invented this nice word, neuroanarchism, which I think should be based on Stirner's embodied egoism. So there's a lot of stuff going on here that I kind of made up on the fly back in my wilder years. And then I gave a talk, which eventually became a paper, a chapter in this edited volume, which is called Ethics of the Care for the Brain, Neuroplasticity with Stirner, Malabou, and Foucault. And the names are actually part of the content. There's a little bit less brain in them than I promised. So I'm afraid it's a little bit false advertising. And I hope I can make up for that now and maybe in a future paper. So part of what I did in that chapter is that I read Stirner's notion of Eigentum through Uexküll's concept of Umwelt. And I also read the way in which he talks about ideology and the way it possesses us and our insurrection against ideology, or spooks as he calls it, through the role of embodiment in Merleau-Ponty and Iris Marion Young. I'm not going to repeat that because it's in the paper, but what's sort of missing from there is an account of perhaps the most difficult ways of speaking that Stirner employs, which are self-positing and self-dissolving, or I think he says self-consumption, and the way that they contribute to what he calls the creative nothingness. And I believe that we can read about and read alongside accounts of self-organization and the plastic and dynamic brain in a way that helps us make sense of these more complicated or puzzling notions in Stirner's work. So in a sense, what I'm doing here is a little bit like continental naturalism, and I think there are strong resonances both with Malabou's work and with the work of Adrian Johnston that I should work more on at some further point. And I do think that continental naturalism has a lot of potential, even though I am uneasy about the term naturalism itself and also the commitments to materialism that a lot of the more prominent proponents have. But I wanted to do a little advertising section here for a project which I think is very similar in spirit, called dialecticalsystems.eu is the URL. And these are people who work with, some of them in biology or in cognitive sciences or in the philosophy of those fields. And I feel like they are doing what the people in continental naturalism are trying to do, but coming more from the side of the sciences. And they're inspired by this great work from the 80s, The Dialectical Biologist by Lewins and Levontin. And then these are some of the books of the people that have contributed to that website. So I highly encourage everyone to check that out. And this is sort of the perspective that's informing my reading of Stirner here. which you might want to call a resolute reading of these different passages. So when he says that I consume myself means only that I am, or I do not assume myself because in each moment I am really setting up or creating myself for the first time. And I'm only I, not by being assumed, but by being set up. And again, set up only in the moment when I set myself up, i.e. I am creator and creature in one. I think that we can try to read these as close to literal as possible. So in the context, when we read him as in the context of Hegelianism in the 1840s, or even in some later discussions where people read him in different contexts, maybe as a proto-post-structuralist, he sounds a little bit like a megalomaniac, and these I don't want to read these as fanciful daydreams, but I think that these are actually descriptions of real processes of living subjectivity. So when he says, for example, I live my life the way a bird sings, roughly, I think what we can find here is something like a mute naturalism, where the creativity of creative nothingness really comes out of processes of living, but in a way that isn't determined by essentialism or by a species, but sort of a kind of joyous emergence in the self-organization of the individual. And I think the sciences of mind and life, in particular embodied cognition, can help us do this. So the first real bit of content here is, how does the notion of self-organization help us? What do we need from it? I think we need an understanding of self-organization, which helps us make sense of creative nothingness and these notions of self-positing and self-dissolution. And also we want to be able to think that individual agency can exist in the natural world in a way that's not just an idealist fiction. And sort of this tension, I think, is very close to a lot of what Adrian Johnston works on under the label of material subjects. And to me, the most useful account of this begins with the work on autopoiesis by Varela and Maturana and the Tree of Knowledge, which then gets taken up in The Embodied Mind, which is one of the formative books of embodied cognitive science in the early 90s. And you see this little diagram here on the left, where autopoiesis, which means self-creation roughly, is depicted as a circle that feeds back into itself. And this notion goes all the way back to Kant's critique of judgment, and where in the second half he's talking about teleology in biology and the problem of how to account for natural purposes, which is his way of talking about living organisms that seem to embody, embrace, and pursue their own purposes in a way that can't be reduced to mechanistic explanation. This is a big problem. And he also allegedly was the first philosopher to use the term self-organization to talk about this, the idea that in a living creature, all the parts are both cause and effect of each other. So you have the self-organizing system or autopoietic system. And then the arrows on the bottom and the little squiggle, which stands in for the entire rest of the world. In this original formulation of autopoiesis is talked about in terms of perturbation, and the criticisms of this, some of them are very stark, like Rob Swenson's, are interesting because autopoiesis was accused of being solipsistic and maybe even idealistic in this idea that the system can just create itself and it doesn't really depend on its environment. And the ability of the system to organize itself was emphasized in a way which made it sound as if they are denying the reality of sort of the material world on which the system depends, which of course was never their intention, but it led to this further development where Ezequiel de Paulo, in these two books, among other writings, he looked at different theories of self-organization and also accounts of what it means to be alive, because in biology, these two problems are very similar. And accounts of what it means to be alive often are something like a laundry list, where you say, well, you have to have a membrane that encloses you so that there's a definite boundary of the entity, and you have to have metabolism, and you have to be able to repair yourself so that you don't stop existing immediately. And De Paulo said that there's something very unprincipled about these laundry lists, and instead he proposes what he calls a dialectical model, where there are two basic tendencies: total openness of the system, which enables the system to take in matter and energy from the outside in order to feed the processes that keep it going. And in fact, the processes that are the system, because it's nothing over and above this self-organizing process of processes. and the opposite tendency, which is total closure. So in order to be and remain an entity, the system also has to have this tendency of closing itself off, of individuating itself. And the dialectical interplay of these two tendencies in Ezequiel Di Paolo's account of self-organization is not just the nature of a self-organizing system, which includes all living systems, but it's also instrumental in his definition of what agency is. So agency is the ability to strategically mediate the, you could say, contradiction, if you're feeling Hegelian, between these two basic tendencies. And I think that this is basically what is happening when Stirner says he dissolves himself or consumes himself and posits himself at every moment. So I think that, well, it's important that there's no principle or external determining factor or no prior causal principle or genetic determinism that imparts form on the matter here, but really what creates this whole is nothing but the process itself. So the process is its own creator and creation. And I think that self-positing and self-dissolution can be read as the two basic ingredients of biological and cognitive self-organization. What's interesting here is that one way to think about this, both original autopoiesis and this further development by Di Paolo, is in analogy to a single-celled organism, because the boundary then would become the cell membrane and so on. But it's important to note that in activism, which is one of the flavors of embodied cognition that is in which this notion of autopoiesis plays a central role, the schema of self-organization is supposed to scale up and also refers to self-organizing sets of behavior. So there can be certain actions that create the possibility for other actions or the conditions in which you can take further actions. So behavioral circuits take on a kind of self-organization that is very similar to the agency of a single cell maintaining itself, which is useful for us because it brings us closer to the level, the personal level from which Stirner is speaking. So I think when he talks about self-positing and self-dissolution and creative nothingness, one way to read the nothingness is to say that from the level of first-person experience and from the level of speech, there's nothing in terms of no linguistic determination, or there's no determination of the features and the direction of this process of self-organization that takes place at the linguistic level, but that doesn't mean that there's literally nothing there, it doesn't mean emptiness, but it means that the process of self-organization creates features that come up on the level of personal experience or the level of linguistic expression in this fluid way, and they arise and also perish in the dynamics of self-organization. The second question is, what do we need from the brain in order to be able to read Stirner in this rigorous way, or in terms of a mute naturalism? I think we need an understanding of the brain which makes sense of creative nothingness and these two processes of self-positing and self-dissolution, but also it needs to make sense of our ability to get rid of the ideas we already hold in terms of ideology, which we've heard of earlier today as well. And we need an image of the brain, an understanding of the brain in which our fate is not determined by our species being, roughly our genome. So there's this kind of unholy alliance between neurodeterminism, the idea that our behaviors are caused by the structures of our brain and its parts, and the idea from evolutionary psychology that the specific characteristics of the parts of our brain are determined a long time ago by adaptation in our species history, which is what's on this slide. I just said this, but it's nice to remember that this resonates so strongly with Feuerbach's linkage of the brain as the truth of the self and gender as the truth of the self. So nowadays, you can read evolutionary psychology explanations of different human behaviors that occur today as explained and determined by adaptations tens of thousands of years ago in the history of our ancestors. And these adaptations are supposed to be encoded in our genome in such a way that different parts of our genome determine the specific structure of a part of our brain that is responsible for the specific behavior. Well, the good news is that evolutionary psychology doesn't really work, but we still have to contend with neurodeterminism. And one way to do this is to take up the notion of plasticity, which already has happened within continental naturalism and also adjacent fields like anthropology in very exciting ways. It also enables us, at least conceptually, to overcome neurodeterminism, and the brain becomes one domain for existential and political projects. But some of the details are unclear. Partly this is my fault. They're unclear to me because I have too many different projects and I don't read enough just neuroscience. But there are also different problems about time scales, where a lot of times plasticity takes place at a time scale that is not really the time of my personal behavior right now in terms of seconds and minutes, but takes longer. And there's a great paper that I draw on, and I wanted to discuss more originally, but I'm not going to do that. I just encourage you, if you want a very current account of the history of concepts of functional localization, which is the idea of functional localization is what this neurodeterminist story depends on. It's the idea that there's something like little boxes in your brain that are responsible for different features of your character and different behaviors. And it has been questioned in various ways. I'm only going to take up one of these specific critiques, which I'll get to in a second. So if we take up neuroplasticity for a reading of Stirner, we might think that sort of at any given moment in time, there's some degree of agency I have in different ways: epistemic, affective, and behavioral flexibility. And if I change the way that I behave, the actual structure of my brain also can change at a sort of longer time scale, in dependence of the degree of plasticity that there actually is in my brain. And there are ways in which the change in my behavior on a shorter time scale interacts with the longer term flexibility of the connections in my brain. And then also because my behavior doesn't actually take part within the brain, but it takes part in the real world, in real social environments and so on. If I want to behave in different ways, I also have to change the social and material landscape in which these behaviors take place. So there are different kinds of plasticity that are interlinked, but I don't want to go too much into this because it's also, some of this is in the published chapter in the Malabou volume. And the problem of different timescales, just here again, a lot of plasticity seems to take place in terms of days and years, but we also need some elbow room on the level of not necessarily milliseconds, but in terms of this temporal scale of our everyday life. We need to have an account of how it is that we might self-posit and self-dissolve and exert our agency as creative nothingness in a way that doesn't take a day or a year for us to change. And this is a specific critique of the idea of functional localization that I want to take up here, in addition to the notion of plasticity. So I'm trying to sort of broaden our repertoire in thinking about the brain in ways that attack the determinist vision and instead allow us to conceptualize the brain as something that self-organizes, or as something through which we self-organize in a way that makes Stirner's account of creative nothingness appear more natural. So this picture on the left is a classic picture of phrenology, which is a kind of joke now and gets invoked as an example of bad science and ridiculous science. But if you look at a lot of actual cognitive neuroscience, functional localization, which is the basis of phrenology, is alive and well. There's, for example, this homunculus on the right side, where in one part of the brain, different areas are supposed to correspond to the different parts of our body, which actually works less well than we commonly get told. And the book in which I read about that is called After Phrenology, Neural Reuse and the Interactive Brain by Michael Anderson, which is great. It's from 2014, but it gives a pretty broad vision. It summarizes a lot of the problems for localization and gives a broad vision and tries to provide sort of a conceptual framework for thinking about the brain in a different, more dynamic manner. And the basic story is that he did a big meta-analysis where he looked at all these results that say, well, we found out that happiness takes place in this small part of the brain, or whenever we are using our working memory, this particular area lights up on our scanners. And what he found by looking at thousands and thousands of studies is that every single, no matter at what scale you divide up the brain, each part of the brain is involved in many different, very heterogeneous tasks that might be attention and emotion and memory and so on. This is see on the right, the individual functional fingerprints of different regions of the brain that are all, I use the word pluripotent. That's not a word he uses, but they have the potential to take part in these very different behaviors. And instead of components that are self-sufficient and have a function on their own and then get stuck together like building blocks, what actually makes up the mind are what he calls transiently assembled local neural subsystems, or talents. And my very brief suggestion here is that talents, which are the constituents of large-scale functional networks, and they have their meaning only as parts of a larger whole, so not as individual components. And also, they don't have fundamental functions, but they have sort of a set of causal properties that allows them to play very different roles in different configurations and circumstances. And the way that the brain produces behavior is by several of these talents forming a larger functional network that performs a single function or task and then dissolves. And I read this process in which different talents form this larger coalition and then achieve some function on the level of the whole organism and dissolve afterwards back into this state in which they are all pluripotent and capable of entering into a vast variety of different functional organizations in the next moment. This, I think, is just a description in terms of the brain of what Stirner says when he says that he self-posits and self-dissolves at every moment. So I think we should read these alongside each other, ideally doing a lot more, careful textual work and trying to work out the details of this, which I have failed to do today. But I think that we can read creative nothingness as something in the brain as well, where it's not a substance or an object, but instead it's a state of the system in pluripotentiality, in which it hasn't taken on any of the functional determinations that it's capable of. So in one sense, creative nothingness means the state in between these different temporary configurations and functional assemblages, but it also, I think, means the process by which the brain or the unique one moves itself out of and back into the state of sort of functional neutrality. And I promised in my abstract a third account, which I am not going to go into detail on here because I probably don't have time, which is a very fascinating work by Yoav Stone on adaptive improvisation, which is the way that he speaks about specific emergence of novelty, which cannot really be accounted for by genetic determinism. So in his research, there are fruit flies, and the microbiome in their gut develops the ability to digest things that they can't digest, and there's no genetic basis or mechanism that could account for this adaptability. Instead, he calls it adaptive improvisation, which is sort of like a random walk in which the individual stumbles upon possibilities that only come about through its own movement through this sort of problem space. And he says the mechanism is there is no mechanism, which is nice because the topic of mechanistic explanation is interesting and sort of prevalent in philosophy of science, but there are also some parts of the history of materialism which rely on the concept of a mechanism. So I see an interesting sort of conceptual hinge there that I would like to explore further in the future, but don't really have time for that right now. So to summarize, I think that biological and cognitive self-organization gives us a template for reading self-positing, self-dissolution, and creative nothingness as the factors of this self-creating or autopoietic process. And I think that the unique one basically is such a self-creating autopoietic process. I think that neuroplasticity and the pushback against functional localization in the brain show us that our fate is not sealed and determined by the brain, but also that the brain enables behaviors to take place by assembling transient subnetworks, which then form larger functional networks in a way that is very similar to the self-positing and self-dissolution of the unique one as the creative nothingness, which it does, I think. And I think that the way that a unique one posits and dissolves itself is within and through its behaviors, and it enacts these behaviors in pursuit of its enjoyment. There's one additional little bit, which is nice because sometimes Stirner seems to very radically and almost systematically overestimate his ability to overcome ideology and to empower himself and to stage this insurrection against his own socialization, upbringing, and his psyche. I mean, all of this is before psychoanalysis, but from a psychoanalytic perspective, certainly would be a lot more pessimistic about our ability to free ourselves, with the usual caveats about the notion of freedom. And indeed, there are some parallels. There are passages in the unique one here, which read like ego rollback. He describes almost bodily reactions where we have a very bad time because our body is inflicting all kinds of conditions on us to punish us for self-empowerment. But from the perspective of second-order cybernetics, there's a very systematic argument for overestimating your own possibilities and sounding like a megalomaniac, which is that principled hyperbole is necessary if you want to find out how much you're capable of. I call this a cybernetic imperative, and I forgot whether I stole this from von Förster or Glasersfeld, one of those guys. And the basic idea is that if you're uncertain about the boundaries of your possibility space, always overestimate what you can do. So if you're unsure whether your agency is 100 points, or it's maybe just 80 points, or it might be 120 points, then go with your highest estimate, because if you underestimate your own abilities, you will never find out what you might have been capable of. So there's a pragmatic sense in which just you will achieve less if you impose these epistemic limits on your own abilities, but you also can't find out what you're actually capable of unless you go to the limit. So this justifies both specifically in terms of the unique one sort of enacting its own agency and self-empowerment. So overestimating your own abilities has a very principled pragmatic reason, but also when we are reading the sciences of mind and life alongside Stirner or alongside continental philosophy, I think that there are certain kinds of speculative exaggeration that can be justified through like a parallel argument, especially if you're reading Stirner. So I think we have some advantage here. I don't know, I was talking very fast, which is probably bad. I'm not sure whether I have more time. I have some more slides, but they're mostly curveballs. So I'm just going to say thank you, and then I hope you have questions.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Tim. So yeah, we're moving to a Q&A portion. You can just type them in the chat and I'll go ahead and read those. And then you could either, for either panelist, Corey or Tim. Okay, so we have one question to Tim. Why don't you consider the biological work of Carl Wozen, who opens towards the transformation of transformation, also in evolution, rather than the banal recovery of dialectics as a one-size-fits-all mechanism?
I've heard of Rosen, but I haven't read him. So thank you very much for the suggestion. I wrote that down and will do that. As concerns the problem of dialectics, it's funny because I'm not, I mean, as someone working on Stirner, I'm not super interested in reading him as a Hegelian. So it's a little bit weird that I'm talking about dialectics. I do think it's interesting that the inactivists themselves have started talking about dialectics as a method for doing cognitive science. But one thing that is concerning to me, or at least interesting, is that when you think about a process like the one, this development of autopoiesis that I described as dialectical, that seems to be dialectical in a sort of limited sense, where the dialectics is only taking place within the object of our scientific study, the way that you might find it in Engels talking about chemistry or something like that. And even though I'm not a Hegelian by any stretch, the more interesting and deeper conception of dialectics that I find, for example, like in Adorno's explanation of Hegel, where dialectics also has to take into account the development of our own concept, sort of in a dynamic relationship to the object and its development. I think there's a lot of potential there for looking at the history of science and the history of philosophy of science in order to sort of trace the development of these concepts and kind of integrate that with dialectics on the level of the object, which is not sorry, that's not an answer to the question, but thank you very much for the suggestion.
Another question, I believe, to Tim. How can the unique as an anti-concept be formulated in conceptual naturalistic sense?
Thank you. That's a great question. And probably the answer is that it can't and shouldn't. And I have to, that's definitely, I mean, that's a real challenge that I have to grapple with when developing this account of notions of self-organization in the life sciences that sort of run in parallel to what Stirner is doing. I think there's definitely also, I have to be more clear about whether I'm trying to really explain what Stirner is saying in terms of these biological processes, or whether I think that there's some kind of parallel or resonance. I definitely don't think that, you know, we can naturalize Stirner in a way that would exhaust what he's saying or kind of reduce it to the vocabulary of the sciences of mind and life. I don't think that the unique one, and I think that it's important to highlight that it has this very special status as a piece of language that is supposed to have zero content. I think there are other ways of thinking about this that are also kind of new in terms of what Kripke talks to as rigid designators, which don't have conceptual content. So there's this weird parallel in analytic philosophy of language between accounts of names as descriptions, which have descriptive content, versus accounts of names as rigid designators, which are sort of mere pointers. And I think these mere pointers are very similar to what Stirner is doing with the unique one, which is a different half-baked abstract that I have. But if you're interested in that, please feel free to contact me and I'll send you the notes.
All right, we have another question from Adam. First of all, if these are unorthodox uses of Stirner, then damn the orthodox uses. But as a question for both panelists relating to the point earlier made regarding Stirner's dual rejection of the punitive and curative as being one side of the same coin, where do you say, or where would you say that each talk intersects when it comes to the legal exclusionistic and increasingly exterminationist policies against queerness based on biological taxonomies, which are themselves rarely distinguished from any kind of genital phrenology, and the critique of biological paradigm that reterritorializes on stringent and quasi-phrenological taxonomies when it comes to brain and cognition? That was open to either one, Tim or Corey.
I definitely don't have a good answer, but I have something that is like tangentially related, just like my other non-answers, I guess, which is this weird idea that sometimes even in defense of the legitimacy of trans identities, people cite studies about the brains of different human beings. And the argument goes that if you look at the brain of a woman who's trans in a scanner, then you can see that the brain is more similar to a cis woman's brain than to a cis man's. Allegedly, I'm not sure whether that's actually a true claim about the studies, but assuming that it is, I think there's a weird problem going on here where the brain again is treated as determining the person rather than the other way around. And this does not make a lot of sense if you look at it, for example, in comparison to another famous study about taxi drivers, where allegedly the taxi drivers in London have a specific area of the brain that is a lot bigger than it is for normal people, because that area is involved in navigating around a city in a car. But we wouldn't therefore think that they are born taxi drivers, or that somehow their brain determines them to be taxi drivers. So I think that being a woman and living a life as a woman, we would expect the brain to be affected by that, and then we would expect to be visible on a scanner that you are a woman, and that doesn't mean that your brain determined you to be a woman, but that means that being a woman shaped your brain in the same way that it does for other women.
Another intersection that I'm thinking of coming to my mind is in sort of conversations within like trans politics, I guess is the term that I would use, is the issue of like trans medicalization and trying to make certain things like gender dysphoria to be like the essence of what it takes to be trans, whereas other individuals are really against using a diagnosis aspect to legitimate the validity of being trans. I think that it would be some other form of reification to make something into this sort of medicalized state, I guess. Yeah, I think that's the best answer I could muster off the top of my head.
All right. We have a question for Corey. Have you taken into consideration the difference between a nation state and a state nation in your analysis? In other words, most people live where their ancestors live, and thus there is a closer connection between the state and national culture. This also applies to Stirner's Prussia. The United States is different in that it doesn't have a similar original/core group, and thus wields power differently.
I've thought about it a little bit. If there's a difference between the nation state and the state nation for Stirner, I think the way that I would go about answering it is that there's still, even in America and the United States, there's a constructed human essence where if I were to say, oh, there was an American here, the image that might come to most people's mind would be of a presumably straight white man. So there is this idea already of American being synonymous with this concrete person that I don't think there needs to be an explicit like historical national origin or a nationalist project to build what is the nation for Stirner here. It's just whatever is considered the invisible identity of that particular state, I think would be the best way to think about the nation in Stirner's language. Just with all of like the different kinds of comments in American politics where people are saying that things that like, I've heard it from so many different conservative talking heads that I can't point to one in particular, but those that say things like anti-racism is anti-American is a very clear demonstration of who's considered full citizen and part of the full nation is, you know, the sort of white supremacist narrative there without even explicitly trying to create it, I think. As for like generations of people living in the same area, I think the invisibleness of that own identity within the state is enough to also make a similar argument. I don't think the distinction needs to be made as much.
All right, I think we have time for a final question, which is directed towards Tim and asks, does the Freudian death drive as that which dissolves biological tension have any place in your reading of Stirner?
Thank you very much. It doesn't yet, and maybe I need to reconsider it. In the past, I have sort of dismissed the idea of the death drive. Following the reading of Bernd Lasker, who was mentioned earlier as an important Stirner scholar, which he is, but he also has fascinating work on Julien Onfray de la Métrie and Wilhelm Reich, which he considers to share a central insight, basically that the superego is bad and needs to go. And when he describes Wilhelm Reich's relationship to Freud, his version of the story is that Freud invented the death drive in order to get rid of the fundamental tension or contradiction between our happiness and civilization or society in any form close to how it exists. So the idea was that Wilhelm Reich saw that like modern capitalist bourgeois society that he and Freud lived in was antithetical to human happiness and basically guaranteed that our lives are pathological and unhappy. And Freud did not want to accept this and then invented the death drive so that the fundamental contradiction that generates all the symptoms can be between eros and thanatos and not between just our drive to flourish and civilization. Maybe that's a little bit too easy to reject it based on that. And I think that there are some interesting parallels between death drive and sort of the increase in entropy or the tendency for the entropy to increase, and some ways in which Stirner, but especially Nietzsche, talk about expending yourself. So Stirner also sometimes says that he consumes himself like a candle consumes itself through its flame or something like that. So I think that there's something interesting going on, especially since I talk about self-organization. Self-organization only works because it consumes entropy. I mean, it speeds up the dissolution of potential energy, and it has some definite conceptual parallels to the death drive, but I haven't really pursued this further. But it's very interesting. Thank you.
Right, excellent. So with that, that'll conclude the panel. I really appreciate the participation.
Yes, thank you to both of our presenters and our moderator. I thought that was an awesome panel. I enjoyed both of the papers a lot. Yes. So thanks everyone for attending the afternoon session. We're going to be ending this Zoom webinar here, and then what's going to happen is in 1 hour, we're going to have the keynote with Saul Newman. But until then, it's just going to be a break. So go be free, and then I will hopefully see you all back for the keynote session, which will last 2 hours total, with the first half being the address itself, the second half being question and answer, or whatever remaining time we have left for question and answer. So I'll see you all then. Thank you so much.